The plain stretched wide and flat beneath a sky that held no mercy. It was a land of dust and stone, where the river bent slow through banks of clay, and where men had learned to shape the earth into their own image. The air here was thick, even in the early hours, carrying the smell of fired brick and bitumen, of sweat and ambition. The horizon was unbroken save for the structure rising at its center, a tower that had no precedent, no equal, no rival in the memory of any living man. This was the Plain of Shinar, a gathering place, a proving ground. The people who lived here were not wanderers. They had ceased their migrations, planted their feet, and declared the ground beneath them sufficient. They spoke one language, and in that language they had found a kind of power. Words meant the same thing to every ear. Instructions were understood without repetition. Plans were executed without confusion. It was a gift, this unity of tongue, and they had used it to accomplish what no scattered tribe could dream of. They had built cities. They had organized labor. They had transformed the flatness of the plain into something that bore the mark of human will. The tower itself was not a temple, though some would later call it that. It was not built for worship, not in the way that altars were built, with smoke and sacrifice and petition. It was built as a monument, a declaration, a symbol of what could be done when men ceased to defer to the unknown and instead took hold of the possible. The bricks were uniform, each one pressed into the same mold, baked in the same kilns that lined the outskirts of the settlement. The bitumen that held them together came from pits to the south, black and sticky, strong enough to bind stone to stone, course upon course, higher and higher, until the base of the tower disappeared into its own shadow, and the summit seemed to stretch toward the ceiling of the world. The work had taken years. Generations had begun it. Generations expected to continue it. There was no single architect, no solitary mind responsible for the design. It had emerged from consensus, from collective ambition, from the shared belief that the earth could be mastered, that height could be achieved, that permanence could be secured. They believed that if they built high enough, they could make a name for themselves, that they would not be scattered, that they would not be forgotten. The rhythm of the work was steady. At dawn, the laborers gathered at the base of the tower. Some carried water, others carried bricks balanced on wooden frames across their shoulders. The overseers stood at intervals, calling out instructions, directing the flow of materials upward along ramps that spiraled around the structure like the coils of a serpent. The sound of labor was constant, the scrape of brick against brick, the slap of bitumen being troweled into place, the low murmur of voices coordinating effort, confirming alignment, ensuring that each new layer sat level upon the one below. There was pride in this work, not the loud, boastful pride of conquerors, but the quiet pride of builders, the kind of pride that came from seeing something grow beneath your hands, from knowing that your labor had added to the height, to the permanence, to the monument that would outlast you. The tower was their answer to the vastness of the plain, to the silence of the sky, to the uncertainty of the future. It was proof that they were not small, that they were not powerless, that they could impose order upon the world and make it hold. But the tower was not only a structure, it was a community. The people who built it lived in its shadow, organized their lives around its construction. The city that surrounded it was thriving, fed by trade routes that converged on the plain, by farmers who worked the fertile land along the river, by craftsmen who produced tools and pottery and textiles. The language they spoke had allowed them to specialize, to divide labor, to create systems of exchange and governance that required precision. Every word had weight. Every sentence carried intention. There was no room for misunderstanding, and so there was no misunderstanding. They believed this would continue, that the work would go on, that the tower would rise until it touched whatever lay above the sky, and that in doing so they would secure their place in the order of things. They did not see themselves as rebels. They saw themselves as capable, as worthy, as justified in their ambition, and then, without warning, the foundation of their unity dissolved. It did not happen with thunder. There was no fire, no visible hand descending from above. The disruption was quieter than that, and far more complete. It began with a single moment of confusion. A laborer at the base of the tower called up to his partner on the ramp, asking for more bricks. The partner turned, looked down, and responded. But the words that came from his mouth were not the words the laborer heard. They were sounds, syllables arranged in a pattern that carried no meaning, no sense, no connection to anything the laborer had ever known. The laborer called again, louder this time, assuming the wind had distorted the sound. The partner responded again, and again the words were wrong. Not foreign in the way that a distant tribe's language might be foreign, but foreign in a way that felt immediate and absolute, as though the very structure of communication had been pulled apart and reassembled into something unrecognizable. The confusion spread quickly. Another laborer nearby turned to ask a question of the overseer and found that the overseer's response was incomprehensible. The overseer, frustrated, repeated himself, but the words only deepened the confusion. Within minutes, the entire worksite was caught in a web of misunderstanding. Instructions could not be given. Questions could not be answered. The rhythm of labor, which had depended on coordination, on shared understanding, on the seamless transfer of intention from one mind to another, collapsed entirely. Men stood in clusters, speaking rapidly to one another, searching for someone who could understand them. Some found one or two others whose words made sense, and they clung to those people, forming small groups defined not by kinship or geography, but by the accident of shared speech. But most found themselves isolated, surrounded by voices that had become meaningless, by faces that had become unreadable. The unity that had made the tower possible was gone. The laborers stopped working. The overseers stopped giving orders. The work that had continued for years, that had seemed as permanent as the bricks themselves, simply ceased. The ramps were abandoned. The tools were set down. The bricks that had been carried halfway up the tower were left where they stood, and no one came to collect them. There was no violence. No one struck another in frustration. No one tore down what had been built. The dissolution was quieter than that. It was the silence of men who no longer knew how to act together, the silence of a crowd that had become a collection of strangers. The work did not end because the people refused to continue. It ended because continuation was no longer possible. By midday, the groups had begun to separate. Those who could understand one another moved toward the edges of the city, gathering what they could carry, preparing to leave. There was no discussion of where they would go, no negotiation, no attempt to preserve what had been built. The tower stood unfinished, its top open to the sky, its base littered with the tools and materials of interrupted labor. The city emptied slowly, family by family, group by group, each one moving in a different direction, following the instinct that told them they could no longer remain. The Plain of Shinar, which had been filled with the sound of human effort, grew quiet. The kilns cooled. The bitumen pits sat untouched. The river continued its slow movement through the clay banks, indifferent to the departure of those who had once bent it to their purposes. Within days, the city was deserted. Within weeks, the wind began to carry dust across the empty streets, filling the spaces where people had walked, where children had played, where markets had gathered. The tower stood alone, a monument to an ambition that had been interrupted, a structure that would never be completed. A reminder of the day when the foundation of human unity was removed and the people scattered across the face of the earth. The remnants endured. The bricks did not crumble immediately, the bitumen held. But without maintenance, without the hands that had shaped them, the structure began to yield to time. The wind wore at the edges. The rain found cracks. The tower that had seemed permanent, that had been built to outlast generations, began its slow return to the earth from which it had been raised, and the silence of the plain became the monument's final testimony, not to failure, but to the limit that had been imposed, not to rebellion, but to the boundary that had been drawn. The people who had built the tower had believed that unity of language was their own possession, a tool they had mastered, a gift they had earned. But the dissolution of that unity revealed the truth. It had never belonged to them. It had been given, and it could be taken away. And when it was taken away, the work stopped. The city emptied. The monument stood unfinished. The wind moves through the ruins still, carrying dust across the plain where the tower once rose. The bricks remain scattered and half-buried, bearing the marks of the hands that shaped them. The silence is absolute, and in that silence the permanence of the intervention is made clear. What was scattered cannot be gathered. What was confused cannot be clarified. The work will not resume.